All right. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. These virtual events are so strange because you have to kind of cover the whole gamut. We see people chiming in the chat from all over the country, and I know a few folks from the UK as well. So welcome to this. I'm really excited to have Rebecca and Rob with us today virtually for a Point Raised Books event. I'm just going to mention a few things and I'm going to get out of the way so they can get to the conversation. Just a couple of things about the event itself. You'll see the chat function to the right on your screen, and feel free to hop on there to say where you're coming from or to ask questions. We have a little question box at the bottom. You'll see that. You can click on that and type in a question there. I'll be monitoring the chat throughout so I can answer any questions as well that are more technical. Rob and Rebecca will take some of your questions kind of toward the end of the event, but feel free to chime in with a question at any point. The nice thing about this is that you don't have to wait to raise your hand at the end. You can type in a question there. I just want to mention an upcoming event next week. We have Jessica J. Lee and Bathsheba Demuth in conversation about Jessica's new memoir, Two Trees Make a Forest. That is a week from today, same time at noon. Jessica will be joining us from the UK, and so we've been doing a lot of these lunchtime events, which is nice because you can kind of do this and then it's kind of nice, but it's also kind of a letdown because you get done and then I'm at home and I can't hang out with anybody afterwards. So, but Rob McFarlane, who will also join us later next month, he'll join us virtually for the paperback release of Underland, says of Two Trees Make a Forest that it's a beautiful book about the distance between people and places and the means of their bridging. So if you would like to register for that, that's also on our Crowdcast page. Feel free to register for that today, and we'll send a reminder as well. And as I mentioned, in the coming months, we'll have virtual visits again from Rob McFarlane, Carrie Arsenal, and John Freeman, as well as Dan Beatty Quick and others. So keep an eye on our website. You can sign up for our newsletter there. And we will keep bringing you these events, as much selfishly for our part, because I have really been beating the drum for Rebecca's book. I will mention before I get to their quick bios that I actually accosted, maybe not accosted is a strong word, but I sent Rebecca a DM on Twitter asking if there were galleys of her book. One of the benefits of being a bookseller. So she put me in touch with her editor, who I got this bound manuscript, which you'll see here, all of my dog-eared pages. And I want to show you the actual real book now because the cover is gorgeous. It's a beautiful object and suitable for the writing that it contains. So thank you for that. And now quickly, I'm going to introduce Rob Moor, who's been to the store. Rob, his first book, On Trails, won the National Outdoor Book Award, among other prizes. He is currently at work on a new book entitled In Trees, which of course is right up our alley. And looks like he's literally in trees at the moment. So thanks for joining us, Rob. And Rebecca, as I mentioned, is an award-winning author, an essayist from Perth, Australia, and Fathoms is her first book, which we're here to celebrate today. And with that, I'm going to get off the screen and let you two get to it. I can't wait to hear what kind of insights and conversation you have. I really appreciate you both joining us, and for everybody in the audience joining us as well. Thank you, and we'll let you take it away.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, well, thank you, Rebecca. I can't tell you how much I love your book enough, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. I've done one of these digital events, virtual events before, and in that one I asked people what drinks they were having while they were watching so they could put in the comment section. But it's currently noon here, and that seems a little early even during a pandemic. So to warm up the comment section, I'm going to ask you a kind of a popsicle stick joke, and you guys can try and guess the answer. The popsicle stick joke is, why did the marine biology student get an F on his essay about whales? And at the end of this conversation, I'll tell you the answer. I bet Rebecca knows. Okay, so Rebecca, let's start with you. I want to know a bit about you, and I'm sure other people do. The story behind the story. Where are you from, and how did you become a writer?
The potted history of of my genesis as a writer. I'm from the west coast of Australia. I'm from Perth, which is the capital on the small shoulder of the west coast. It's a very famously calls itself the world's most isolated capital city. The reason being that it's sort of sandwiched between a huge rock surface in the interior of Australia that's pretty hard land. It's some of the rocks and minerals on that land actually share birthdays with the minerals on the moon. And then you have this margin of arable land where Perth is, and on the other side you have the Diamantina Trench in the Indian Ocean, which is the deepest marine trench in the Indian Ocean. So you're sort of sandwiched between very ancient time and very deep space. And I think that probably inflected the kind of writing that I do. It's Noongar Whadjuk country is the Indigenous peoples who are the custodians of the land there. And yeah, I grew up there. I didn't leave there till I was about 30 when I went across to Sydney for a couple of years. And I'd started writing short fiction when I was younger. I used to write short stories. But Fathoms is really my first attempt at narrative nonfiction. And I think that quite a few of the techniques that I developed as a sort of short fiction writer end up in the narrative, scene writing of the book as well. So I'm often asked about the lyricism in the writing, and I think that that's somehow kind of using a skill base that I developed as a fiction writer. Yeah.
So you mentioned the type of writing you do, and I wonder if you could just help Stephen out here, and me to an extent, because I do a similar type of writing. What genre of book is this? Like, what would you call it? Is it nature writing? Is it science writing? Is it like I don't know, like some people call these things a single topic book, like salt or rain or whatever. Have you come up with a term for what kind of writing this is?
I think it's not a science communication project in the way that it's not intending to provide, I suppose, a kind of transparent communication of scientific findings. It's written from within a science literate or science curious community, as I am. I'm not a biologist, I'm not a scientist, but I'm someone who's science curious. But it is a book that springs from cultural narrative that is interested in sort of history and philosophy. It's very sprawling in that way. It's been called nature writing, and I'm happy with that label. But also, I think there are significant differences between writing about animals, particularly, and writing about landscapes, or even writing about ecological systems. So, while I'm absolutely thrilled to kind of be filed on the shelf next to the Robert Macfarlanes and the Robert Moors of this world, I also think that there's a kind of different ethical charge when you're writing about another animate life form. So writing about animals.
Do you see that? Do you see yourself as part of a tradition of animal writing? Are there other animal writers or animal books that have inspired you?
Yeah, I mean, Helen Macdonald's wonderful H is for Hawk, which of course, looms large over the whole genre, was a hugely impressive, book in my thinking. But I also think my aesthetic impulse is often towards uncanny ways of looking at the world. So rather than sort of a lot of nature writing kind of leaps from the romantic tradition, and it tends to be like an individual venturing out into the natural world to have adventurous encounters and to kind of glean some knowledge through experience. Whereas Fathoms, there are chapters in Fathoms that are focused on museum archives, on the digital world as well. So not just where we encounter animals in nature, but where we encounter them online through social media. And I think, a part of that has to do with my interest in the sort of textures of the uncanny in our experiences of environments now.
You capture that really, really beautifully, and I could list a dozen examples, but I want to start at the beginning, because what I think is at least how I understand it, this began with a piece you wrote for Granta called Whale Fall, which, among me and my friends it was like an instant classic. At the moment we read it, we were just blown away by the writing and by this mind behind this piece. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspired that piece, how that piece came to be?
So a few years ago, I helped out at whale beaching near my home in Perth. There was a yearling humpback that had stranded on a sand spit. And the yearling is not a big whale. It's sort of 12 meters or so. They can grow to about 30. But we'd managed to get it out beyond the break. And then a couple of hours later, it returned and stranded kind of higher up the beach. Over several days, it slowly died. So I was down there with the crowd. A huge number of people were drawn down. They brought their children, they brought their dogs. Everybody had different theories for why whales might strand and why this whale particularly had stranded, because it didn't have any visible injuries to start with. So, some people thought perhaps it was sick. Others believed it had been attacked or chased by sharks or killer whales. Somebody even told me they thought whale beachings were connected to falling stars. So they had a sort of cosmological explanation for these events. And so I kind of was gathering thread. I was writing bits and pieces down at that point. But it wasn't until some years later when I'd read a news story from Spain where a sperm whale had washed up on the coast. This is really the sort of inciting incident to go back to write about the whale beaching. This whale washed up just south of Granada in Spain, which is very famously near Almeria, which is the salad bowl of Europe, where all the big greenhouses are. And it had in its stomach the most stupendous medley of objects. It had swallowed an entire greenhouse. So with flower pots, with hose pipes, with, it had a spray canister that had been used to administer herbicide. And it had stranger objects yet. It had, like a coat hanger, bits of bedding. And I think I read that story in the newspaper and just thought, here is this icon of 1980s environmental success, the Save the Whales campaigns, which I remember vaguely from my childhood. And it's literally consuming the metaphor that we use to talk about climate crisis. Like the greenhouse is the icon that we use to explain global warming. And so it was just one of those things that, if you put it in a short story or a novel, it wouldn't have been believed. It felt too powerful to walk past. So that was really the moment at which I went back to the whale beaching to see if I could utilize that to also then begin talking about pollution.
Yeah, that's a topic I want to explore a lot deeper. First, can you just tell us what is a whale fall? I mean, as far as I understand, that's what happens when a whale dies out at sea and sort of sinks down. What happens to a whale's body when it dies out in the open ocean?
Yeah, so when I was on the beach, the dying whale in front of us was a very tragic moment. But later I went off and did some research and I spoke to some scientists and discovered that, a whale's death doesn't have to be cast as a tragedy. It can prove a real turning point in the deep sea. So where a whale dies in the open ocean, the descent of its body down the water column to settle onto the ocean floor is tantamount to the arrival of springtime in the deep sea. It provides this huge injection of energy. So as the body's descending, it gets picked at by crabs and by predatory fish and sharks that are attracted to the carcass. And then it drops down to where it's very dark and you get even stranger animals emerge, this sort of bewitching menagerie of creatures that you can scarcely imagine have names because they don't even seem to have bodies. They're, they look like streamers or they look like musical instruments that have been turned inside out. And eventually the whale settles onto the silt on the seafloor. And then you get a whole flourishing of creatures that pretty much only eat whale carcasses, particular kinds of worms and mussels and tiny little clams that broadcast their larvae out into the water to be dormant, and they just float around like stardust in the sea until they encounter whale carcass, and then they'll generate into these larger organisms. And so these creatures can, go many, many years without encountering a whale. And some of them are so specialized, they only eat one species of whale. They only eat like the bones of the humpback or the bones of the gray whale. And yeah, it's just like, it's this moment of great fecundity and gene exchange. And I think it really, that image, which is in the first chapter, really powers the rest of the book, because I began to see the whale as itself an ecology, not just a kind of being, but an animacy within a kind of ecological cycle and a creature that other creatures depended on.
Yeah, that reminds me. There's this theme in the book of entanglement or ecology, and that's something that we all grow up with, learning that we're all part of the web of life, and it's sort of almost become a cliche, like we don't even really pay attention to it anymore, or it doesn't feel vibrant. And that's one of the really incredible things that you achieved with this book, is you managed to blow the dust off of that and show all the ways that we're entangled with whales in really surprising ways, both physically and intellectually. And so it's like you took this like piñata, which is the whale. The whale itself is almost a kind of ecological, environmental cliche at this point. We know, it's a child's stuffed animal, and you burst it open, and all this stuff comes springing out. The greenhouses and sea fleas and Sigmund Freud, and it's just pouring out. It's incredible. Can you give us a couple of examples of the ways that we are entangled with whales in surprising ways that surprised you?
Well, yeah, I mean, part of the project was really, when I was stuck with the structure of the book, I would just take the whale body and say, okay, well, I'm just going to write about the blubber, or I'm just going to write about the ballenes that are in the mouth of the whale. Some whales have a kind of fibrous tissue in their mouth in place of teeth. It's kind of like a mustache on your inner lip. So it was very much a kind of process of decomposing the animal myself, and then trying to find like points of connection, nexuses of connection. I think, the most surprising research that came out of that actually had to do with the air, which I have this idea that whales, of course, are marine animals, and they live in marine ecosystems. They feed from marine food webs. So it was just so stupendous to me to learn that actually the large whales have chemically altered the composition of Earth's atmosphere, and that's a measurable phenomena. And they do this because the largest animals on the face of the planet are actually interconnected in an exquisitely fine-tuned way with these tiny little plant-like organisms, plankton, that are at the bottom of the food pyramid. And effectively, the movement of the whales up and down in the water column, and the way that they feed at a low depth, but then defecate up when they come to the surface. They kind of leave these long, wafty poos in the sea that are the manure that kind of ignites the growth of plankton. And plankton absorb carbon and they emit oxygen on a planetary level. So if you've got a lot of whale movement in the sea, if you've got a lot of whales in the sea, you're actually agitating the growth of those plankton. And some scientists now consider whales kind of a passive form of geoengineering. They if cattle are deforming the atmosphere because of their emissions, whales are the opposite. Whales are kind of adding to the offset in a way.
Yeah, there's this theme running throughout the book of inside and outside, interiors and exteriors. And you're, as a child, you're looking at the bones of a blue whale, and you're talking about then all the ways that we end up within the flesh and the blubber of whales through our pollution, and then whales end up inside of us and inside of our processes. And one of my favorite little examples of that is you actually physically ingested a whale at one point. Can you describe what it was like for you, as far as I know, a vegetarian, to eat whale meat? How did that come to pass?
I never intended to eat whale meat. I should say from the outset. I've been vegetarian for some 7 years prior to going to Japan to do a part of the research for this book. And so I'd spent a long time trying to set up an interview with one of the whalers who were at that point involved in this scientific whaling program down in the Southern Ocean, and was getting nowhere. You know, I think Western journalists are often kind of meet with a lot of bureaucracy in that process. So I went down to see the arrival of the big whaling ship, the Nishin Maru in Shimonoseki, hoping just to talk to people. And yeah, through a series of events, largely just by not being kicked out, just by insisting on staying, I ended up kind of standing around with a couple of these whalers, and they offered me a soup that had a piece of minke whale in it. And at that point, I was, I guess, trying to curry favor with them. And I think they also suspected that I might be involved with Sea Shepherd, very famously the activist organization. It's nearly all its members are vegan. So yes, I took a mouthful of this soup and then sort of stutteringly said in very broken Japanese that it wasn't to my taste, and I wasn't, and it was then given to one of the whalers' granddaughters to eat. But
what did it taste like? What is the whale meat? What does it taste like?
I wish I had like a stable comparison, because having not eaten meat for 7 years prior to that, I think it tasted kind of ferric and iron heavy, like beef. But it's sort of hard for me to remember back to when I'd eaten beef before. And this whale meat had been dehydrated, so it'd been kind of made into bacon. So yeah, it was just a fragment that I had, but I didn't get the sort of like, yeah, it was quite, it had a sort of hemal taste to it, metallic kind of taste to it.
And that reminds me of something you mentioned earlier, which is that in the 1990s, the whale becomes this kind of icon of environmentalism. I was born in 1984. I don't know what year you were born, but sometime around then, I think. And it was in my childhood, it was whales and Save the Rainforest. And that was basically the entirety of my environmental consciousness until I was like 16 years old. Why was it that whales suddenly came to dominate the environmental discourse in the like late 80s and 90s? To the degree that they did?
Yeah, so we whaled all the way through the 19th century and the 20th century. And, you know, by the middle of the 20th century, you would have thought that the economic conditions meant that whaling would have disappeared because it was ineconomic. So we had replacement feedstock products that could be used in place of whale oil or in place of ballenes. And it really came down to cultural factors that drove whaling through the 20th century. So the Japanese and the Soviets continued to whale for different geopolitical reasons. And there was also a feeling that fairly soon the international community was going to crack down, and therefore everyone should try and get as many whales as they possibly could before quotas came in. So there was a real rush. They actually call it the Whaling Olympics, those last couple of decades through the 60s, 70s and into the 80s. And, you know, Australia was one of the last English-speaking nations to whale. We whaled up till 1977. My mother is from Albany, down on the southwest coast of Western Australia, which was the last whaling station in Australia. So she remembers, you know, sperm whales being pulled up onto the forecourt there, the smell of them. Her dad was a fisherman, so he would go out into the bay with an oar and literally like strike back the sharks that were feeding on the sides of the carcasses. Yeah, so I mean, it's in lived experience, I suppose, and because she's from that part of the world, it's also a place where there's a lot of whale strandings, smaller whales. So she also had stories about smaller whales, I think, that she told me, or that I kind of had in my family background anyway. But yeah, so we sort of stopped whaling mostly because there were geopolitical reasons, but it also had to do with the fact that there were other big multinational environmental movements taking place in that era. So the idea of kind of trans-hemispheric environmental problems were top of mind after Chernobyl, the ozone hole in the ozone layer, the idea that, the commons was being destroyed. And the commons is like really hard to get your head around if it doesn't have creatures in it, if it doesn't have bodies at stake in it. So, trying to save the ozone layer, we can kind of understand why we would want to do that. But whales were just this amazingly animate, suffering creature that people could really form attachment with, whether they lived on the coast or whether they lived in high rises in the city.
Yeah, and so let's go back a little farther. You described the ways that whaling had created this industry for whale parts, and I had no idea until I read your book the degree to which those whale parts ended up in every facet of the industrial economy. I mean, you mentioned the baleen. There's of course the whale oil. Tell us a little bit about how the body of the whale becomes dispersed throughout our entire modern world.
Yeah, I mean, in a way that we're never very far from sort of plastic objects. Like I can reach around and I can touch plastic objects here, and there's a plastic object here. Our forebears lived in that kind of proximity with products that were either made using the baleens or were generated in their manufacturing with the use of whale oil. So whale oil was produced by rendering down the blubber of the animals and then distilling through heat, essentially, down into this sort of like yellow liquid that was extremely good as a lubricant for machinery, but also really good for burning. So as an illuminant, which meant that whale oil really didn't only become a part of manufacturing processes, it sort of created a background by which manufacturing as a whole changed, because it changed trading hours. Now that we had really good illuminants, we could run factories much later. We could open shop floors much later. It also, it is the beginning of automation. Like this is when people are replaced by machines because those machines can be run using whale oil. And the baleens were like, they went into anything that might be made with plastic now. So they end up in women's garments, in corsets. They end up in police nightsticks. The expression to wail on somebody actually comes from the fact that baleens were used as canes to hit naughty children. So it's an amazing diversity of products. But then in the 20th century, you start to see them used in much more luxury goods. So they go into soaps and cosmetics. Unilever used to own a whaling company, their own whaling company that would go out and get the products that they needed for their soaps, which always blows my mind when I think of how we react to animal testing in beauty counters today. It's only 30, 40 years ago that things were different. And the oil ends up in munitions. It ends up being used in the very finely calibrated instruments that we find in military hardware, and in one case, up on a satellite. So it's used to lubricate the shutters of cameras on some satellites. The reason being that, I've just finished this thought, but the sperm whales are very deep sea living animals, and they go down immense pressure and down into very cold environments. And so sperm whale oil is actually really useful for outer space because you're dealing with extremes of pressure and extremes of temperature, and that's why it's useful there.
I also want to just highlight a little detail I love in your book is about the transoceanic trade and fishing industries start ramping up, a lot more trash gets thrown overboard, and you have this theory about how sea monsters, the sea monsters of yore, may have in fact been just these disgusting amalgams of trash and marine animals, marine mammals. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I love that.
Yeah, the prehistory of sea monsters was a lovely digression to take in this book. Yeah, I got really interested in that story, which I'd read about in some scholarship, looking at the ways in which oral histories around sea monsters might actually have reflected a sort of prehistory of marine debris before polymer substances came in. So when you were still using rope and glass and pig skin and sort of more organic products in the course of fisheries. But of course, those things still decay at a far slower rate than it takes an entangled animal to die. So whether a whale is entangled in a piece of plastic rope or a piece of hemp-based rope, it's still going to struggle against that. So there are a few sort of scholars who think that actually you can find within those descriptions of sea monsters a narrative of debris from the 19th century. And I guess from my perspective, I was interested in the ways in which our stories about the monstrous may betray a sort of wider cultural anxiety about the damage that we do to the natural environment.
Yeah, I also want to just touch briefly upon the question of sound. There's this beautiful theme of sound running throughout this book and song. And of course, everyone knows about whale song and all of the ways that, we've launched whale song into space. And there was, again, going back to the 1990s, or maybe earlier, maybe it was the 70s, there was this fad for listening to records of whale song. What was it about whale song that spoke to this notion of sound as it pertains to the ocean? Why did that end up becoming so integral to the book?
I think I'd always thought of most animals kind of having an innate sound, like a frog is born with a certain kind of call, a bird is born with a certain kind of voice. And then I started to learn about the fact that whale song is not static. It changes season to season, year to year, particularly the humpback whales, which are, amazing vocalists and have very complex songs. And I really got fascinated by the ways in which that pointed to a kind of animal culture, not just a kind of natural biophony of the sea. So I learned quite early on that humpback whales have effectively pop songs. They have kind of particular sections or fragments within their songs that they become attached to, and they sort of become in vogue for a year. So they do a lap of the globe. They pass from population to population as they come within earshot of one another. And those songs trend towards greater levels of complexity because scientists think that they're involved in courtship display. So the males are mostly singing. And they get more and more complex. And then there's something that, marine scientists actually call a cultural revolution that sometimes happens, where, the song has got so complex that some whales fail to pick it up. And so they're not achieving as much mating success. And so a song emerges that's much more simple, and that singer stands out more against that backdrop.
Whale punk rock.
Sorry?
So it's like a kind of whale punk rock as opposed to a whale prog rock.
Yeah. So I had assumed that the whales that were on those records from the 70s were the sounds of the animals now. But whatever those sounds designate, whatever it is they're communicating, that's not the way the whales of today sing.
Well, one of the most chilling lines from your book is the description of the way that the marine acoustic ecosystem has disrupted whale song, and all of the industrial noise that we're pumping into the oceans at one point you described, that the range has shrunk of whale song traveling from thousands of kilometers down to, I guess, hundreds. And you say it's as if you used to be able to call to the end of your block, and then, a little bit later you can only call to the house next door. And now it's like as if you have a hand cupped over your mouth. That's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, but at the same time, there's some science to show that the changes in whale song may actually reflect our conservation efforts as well. So a couple of years ago, a really interesting paper came out to show that blue whales and fin whales, and also pygmy blue whales, which are a subspecies, had dropped the pitch of their call by roughly the equivalent of 3 white notes on the piano. So all around the globe, for whatever reason, those different populations of whales were singing at a deeper range. And there are 2 theories for why that might be so. One of them is a really optimistic theory, and one of them is a slightly more pessimistic one. The optimistic theory is that there are simply more whales in the sea now, and so they don't have to be as loud to communicate with one another. And because of the biomechanics of how whales vocalize, when they speak softer, they speak at a lower register, lower pitch. So actually, our conservation efforts may have in fact changed the vocalizations of those animals, but it's because there's more of them now than there was back in the 80s. Yeah.
Yeah, so going back to the 80s and the 90s, when we finally start to the whale conservation movement really starts to ramp up, you seem to find a lot of hope in that moment, that when we start to extend our compassion to these beings that are fairly alien to us, but also strangely kin to us. You have this wonderful line. You say, "A whale is a wonder not because it is the world's biggest animal, but because it augments our moral capacity. A whale shows us it is possible to care for that which lies outside our immediate sphere of action, but within our sphere of influence." Of course, that meaning, all the ways that we unwittingly throw away trash and put pollution into the atmosphere and ends up in the flesh of whales, we're affecting whales. But at the same time, we feel like we can't necessarily directly help them. They're within our sphere of influence, but outside of our sphere of action. That's such an interesting conceptual tool. I love that. Is there, embedded in this book, is there a kind of a call to arms for reconciling those 2 spheres? I mean, if so, what is it? What can we do? What should we be doing?
Yeah, I think, this was the big takeaway for the book for me, was that question of how whales augment our moral capacity. And they help us to understand the ways in which our close lives, our domestic lives, our working lives, our commuting lives, can reach all the way out to touch upon remote wilderness and the stupendous wildlife that's found there. And in a way, even before I'd started working on this book, I was looking for an opportunity to tell a story about global change, where I guess a lot of the writing that I read in that space was so disembodied and so humiliating in a way, because the scale was just so immense. And yet, when I was on that beach in Perth, the feeling that was there was something like, oh, here is the body. Like, here is the body to mourn. We knew there was trouble out there. We knew that there were problems in the ecology. We knew there were problems with pollution, but lacking the sensory apparatus to apprehend those problems, because we can't actually, taste the change in the acidity of the ocean, or, really come to grips with the amount of plastic pollution that's kind of there in this micro-fragmented form. We haven't had a protocol to grieve for it. But we can grieve for a whale. We can attach, empathetically to whale. And indeed, you don't even need to be a particularly sensitive or environmentally minded person to feel something about this huge animal pulling up, injured or dying on the beachfront. And so in a way, it was a bit of a Trojan horse to create in the reader's mind, I hope, some feeling for the vastness of our connection to the natural world, and acknowledge the power of that as well. Not just the kind of it's kind of horrifying to find objects from the kitchen in the stomach of an animal that's in the deep sea. But at the same time, that suggests to you that anything you do in your kitchen is going to prevent, like if you take smaller actions, you can have effects that are that far reaching.
There's the one of the little beautiful ways you end up illustrating one of these horrifying details. You say that there's as much trash being dumped into the ocean each year equals the mass of the Great Pyramids of Giza. Which is the mass, not even that you can imagine the size, the volume of that amount of trash, which weighs much less than a piece of stone. It's really the coming out of this book, you have a much greater understanding of just the incredible extent to which we're affecting the oceans, and then the ways that the oceans are affecting us also. In terms of this current political moment, how do you hope to speak to it using this book? Is there a call to action? What is the I don't know, maybe more concretely, what would you like readers to do after reading this book?
Yeah, I mean, I hold back from prescribing a specific course of action in the book itself. And part of the reason for that is just that I'm conscious of the fact that people need to act within their communities according to their resources and their talents. So, there's maybe one point in the book where I do a bit more of a direct-to-camera comment about the question of hope, and talk about the fact that really, if you want to feel hopeful in this moment, it behooves you to make yourself useful. And you make yourself useful by doing a thorough accounting of what resources you have, what privileges you have, what specific talents you have as well, because that really feels like, to me, it can be hard to be engaged with the environmental realities we confront. But if you work in the service of your talents, you will feel like you're having a more meaningful life as well. And being willing to speak across divides, to speak to people who are on the other side of, of these conflicts as well, and have different opinions. While I kind of stand back a bit from advocating a specific course of action, what I really hope the book does is helps people gather some nerve, like to step off and take some small action in their small, in their immediate world.
So I think we've entered the official question and answer portion of the thing. So if people want to post your questions in the questions section, I will keep an eye on that, and I will ask those to Rebecca. I want to ask first if there were any great anecdotes or pieces of information that you wish you could have included that ended up on the cutting room floor. I know that your editor, John Cox, is actually listening right now. So this is your chance to really, really stick it to him for that beautiful thing he made you cut.
I'm conscious it's getting quite dark here. I hope you can still see me. So what do I wish? Okay, so there's a story in the book about the Eden whale bathers. In the 19th century, there's a town in the east coast of Australia, southeast coast, very famous whaling town, where people would go and they would actually climb inside the carcasses of dead whales to treat it like a spa, to have a therapeutic experience of being swaddled in these rotting tissues. It's grotesque, but the idea was that it would help with rheumatism and arthritis, and also with mental maladies associated with chronic conditions. So it's kind of whale as, depression cure as well. So Eden itself is fascinating, and there are a couple of really great books for other people who are sort of interested in that part of Australian history. Because one thing that I couldn't touch on within the book is the fact that large baleen-bearing whales in that part of the world were hunted using orca. So killer whales were trained in the same way as you can imagine, in Britain, they chase foxes with hounds. These whalers were utilizing the natural instincts of killer whales to encourage them to herd the baleen whales towards the whalers. So they were corralling them using these large black and white killer whales. And they would then kill the baleen whale, the whalers would, and they'd cut out the tongue of the animal and they'd pass it on to the killer whales as a kind of reward.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and there's an Indigenous history. Like I think that the white whalers were really stepping into the shoes of Indigenous whalers in that part of the world before they arrived. So it's a massive story, but that was one that did end up on the cutting room floor that I wish I'd managed to find space for.
So I see a question here in the comments. It says, Rebecca, can you talk a little about how solar weather is hypothesized to affect whales?
Yeah. So you remember someone on the beach said to me, shooting stars are affiliated with whale beachings, which at the time I was just like, oh, that's new age. I was really spurious about that fact. But there are a couple of big scientific papers that have come out in the last couple of years looking at the ways that large whales navigate using magnetic sea marks. So effectively, they're sensitive to the Earth's magnetic fields. And this is how they manage to get from point A to point B in the deep ocean, in the dark, when they're moving, as individuals, not as pods, that they use these kind of magnetic fields to navigate by. And the Earth's magnetic fields can be very subtly affected by changes on the surface of the sun. So the sun has a kind of weather. And occasionally there will be aberrations in that weather, a kind of solar storm that lashes out these energetic waves from the surface of the sun, which never reach Earth, but they do influence Earth's magnetic fields, which means that sometimes whales are drawn off course by changes in the solar weather. And at the same time, one of the impacts of that extremity in solar weather is that you see more aurora. You see more of the northern lights, the colored lights that are at the poles, and you see them in different parts of the world, and they are more vibrant in their color. So at the same time that we're seeing these changes in our immediate, in the stars, that is in some way symptomatic of what's happening to whales in terms of their navigation.
Okay, I have another question here in the questions, which says, Robert and Rebecca, do you have any reading recommendations you'd like to share? So I'll start with you. So I have time to think.
Recommendations. Look, I've just finished reading Lamorna Ash's book, Salt, Dark, Clear. Salt, Dark, Clear, or Clear, Dark, Salt? Salt, Dark, Clear. I did not think that I would get into this book. It's about Cornish fishing, Cornwall fishing industry. But it's beautiful, and it's very prismatic in the way that it approaches the fisheries industry, the history. It's just a luminous little pearl of a book. So I think that's going to come out in the States in the next month or so. It's already out in the UK. So I love that. And then also I have to put a pitch in for an Australian author who's starting to make a bit of a name in the States, but you really should rush to read her. Her name is Maria Tumarkin. She has a book called Axiomatic, and honestly, she's a lodestar in my universe and has been for a long time. But I feel like Americans are just getting to know her with that book, which is sort of her fifth, I think, or fourth book along. So yeah, it's one of the, who's the author who does the bright blue covers with the white writing? The publisher.
I know the British publisher.
Yeah, it's not Faber. It's
Stephen will know. Stephen, put it in the comments. Help us out here, buddy.
Maria Tumarkin's Axiomatic.
It's Coraldo.
Coraldo. I knew it started with an F.
I love it.
Yeah. So I mean, she's just a beautiful nonfiction stylist.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm looking around right here at the books I'm reading currently, just in my little outdoor thing. Of course, this is obvious. You gotta read that one. I'm also reading a beautiful book right now called The Shapes of Native Nonfiction, which is an anthology of contemporary creative nonfiction by Indigenous authors. It's really great. It's inspiring and creatively, and all sorts of people breaking the form in ways that I love. God, there's so many books I'm loving right now. But most recently, I think the novel I've been reading is Weather by Jenny Offal, which also is very germane to this discussion, just about the ways that climate change affects us, or in these uncanny ways that you describe, sort of seeps into our life, and we kind of don't even pay attention to it, or it's just on the periphery of our attention. It's this looming, basically a looming apocalypse that we're all just keeping right in outside of our gaze. And she just hones in on it with these beautiful little fragments, very, very spare prose. It's the kind of book you can just grab and read a chunk here and a chunk there. It's very fragmented. I'm loving that.
When you write, Rob, do you read alongside your writing projects as well, or do you
I do. Well, so I wonder if you do this. What I was doing with On Trails is I wanted to come up with very streamlined, kind of sleek, but also kind of silky and sinuous, all those S words. This voice, which would be very, very elegant, but a little bit juicy. And so I would read writers that I thought were doing that. So I was reading a lot of like James Salter and a little bit of Bruce Chatwin and people like that to try to prime my brain. And, I'm not a very good impressionist. So of course I couldn't mimic it, but it would trigger certain neural patterns, and I would write in a different way than I normally would. Do you find yourself doing that, kind of priming yourself before you sit down to write? And if you do, who are you reading for this book?
Oh gosh. Yeah, I mean, lots of different inputs. I'm sure you could go down into the DNA of the book and actually find sentence structures that were classic Olivia Lang sentence structures, or how do you get those voices out of your head when they've made such an impression on your heart? But yeah, I think Maria was very helpful to me. I love Leslie Jameson. I love Helen Garner. I love, I read a lot of poetry, actually, to prime my writing as well. Rebecca Tamash, who's a really great British eco-poet.
Let's talk a little bit about the voice of your book, actually, because that's something I thought about. I mean, you're doing something very deliberate with I think with the voice of this, which is, it seems to me you've gone through in almost Terminator-like fashion and destroyed all cliches, anything even resembling a cliche. And so the language is just constantly fresh and surprising, and you're turning things on their heads just in even little ways with the grammar and the syntax. What was your mission there, your stylistic mission? And, how did you achieve that voice?
I think I really wanted to highlight the articulatedness of the whale to kind of, as you pointed out, to take this kind of pinata model of breaking the animal open and kind of making the point that, this literally like the stomach connects to the kitchen, or so I was interested in means of language that kind of had a inbuilt, a syntax to them that pointed to that articulatedness in a way. And I wanted to have an ecological sensibility to it as well, and resist any kind of romantic language as much as was possible. And
I could see there being a critique that, because you're describing so many elements of destruction and pollution, that by writing about those things so beautifully, you're kind of making them glow. You're making the ugly beautiful in a way, and you're not. It's maybe muting its impact. I don't necessarily agree with that, but is that something you've thought about?
Yeah, well, I certainly think, you have to go beyond that to say, well, what does the beautiful call us to do? Like, is the beautiful as a form of attention actually just cause us to marvel, or does it actually create some accountability between us and the thing that we're looking at? So I don't try, I think in the most polluted subject of the book, in the chapter on plastic pollution, that chapter has a structure that revolves around a list. So it has a kind of list of objects that appear inside whales, everything from DVD cases to pairs of jeans to golf balls to, one single animal has a shopping bag that was used to carry chicken in Ukraine, an ice cream container from Denmark, and a crisp packet from the UK. So here is this transhemispheric problem distilled down into the animal's body. But the list was a deliberate tactic, not to kind of beautify, but to I always think with listing, you're kind of like pointing to the fact that the subject is a little beyond you. Like you've kind of got stuck. You can only list the reality. You can't kind of analyze it. And so I hope that the form kind of reflected some of my emotional response to the content there. But I am really interested in kind of innovations in form. And, Maria Tamarkin has this great essay where she says, if you're a short fiction writer, no one expects you to have the same voice, story to story to story. But if you're an essayist, you're kind of expected to have a voice that has continuities throughout a collection. And so while I wanted to keep that poetic voice going, I just want to have some structural interventions there towards the back of the book anyway.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll ask Stephen. It's now 1 o'clock. I think we've reached the end of our time. Should we wrap things up? I think that's a kind of a beautiful place to end it. Stephen, do you have any final remarks? Do you have any questions for Rebecca?
No, that was wonderful. I know we had a couple of more questions here. I don't know. We have a few minutes if you want to.
What have we got?
Let's see.
I'm so in the dark now. I look like it's got very gothic here.
Okay, so there's another one here. It says, you spent some time talking about the global governance frameworks that are designed to protect whales, most of which are pretty old and weren't originally developed in a time of climate change. What should change about the way those systems work to protect whales?
Oh, interesting question. I mean, I know that there have been working groups who have attempted to, for example, put whales into the Paris Accord because of the positive impact they have as, benign forms of geoengineering the atmosphere. So there is a real sense in which kind of quantifying the ecological functionality of the animal has become one way in which environmental campaigners have sought to link it to climate change and climate crisis. Whereas the 1980 campaigns were really geared around the charisma of the animal and the feeling of like people being invested in it because it was an animal like us, and it has may have a language, it's sportive, it nurses its young, it's warm-blooded, all of those reasons that we feel the whales are kin in some way. So yeah, the shifting gear now is very much not to talk about that aspect of uniqueness, but rather to point to the ecological function of the creature as a means for its protection. So yeah, that's very interesting. But I also think in the 80s, one of the great powers of the anti-whaling movement was that it united people as a global environmental citizenry. So it didn't matter what nation you were from. You could be from a landlocked nation and never encounter a whale, still have a stake in its survival. And I think looking back to that and keeping some of that consciousness around a globalized environmental citizenry is really important when you're looking down the barrel of some quite difficult political years, like, both in Australia and in America. So yeah, I think there's a kind of internationalization there that's really valuable.
Well, maybe I'm gonna ask the last question as my right as the bookstore representative. I wanted to ask you how has writing this book affected and changed you? And what what do you think comes next? Were you interested in whales before, or did this lead you into this whole realm? And how do you get out of it, or do you get out of it?
Well, I certainly have a sense in which, my everyday connects to the marine environment, even when I'm not in Perth. You're speaking to me tonight in London, where I am very far from the sea and very heart aching for the sea. But I still think about the ways in which my life touches upon the marine environment in a much keener way. That was one of my big takeaways from the time writing the book. And yeah, what I'll do next, I'm not sure at the moment. It's all just a wall of Post-it notes. And I'm taking my time, in this moment to reflect on what kinds of nonfiction are going to be necessary and valuable given the shocks that we're going to experience, not only the pandemic, but everything that's coming up in the next decade. I guess I'm really thinking about what way can I valuably contribute to this historical decade. Yeah.
Well, Thank you both for this. This was really wonderful. You can tell you two are friends. The conversation was wonderful, and I want to thank everybody again for attending. And this has been recorded, so if anyone had any problems staying connected, it'll record and be available for replay almost instantly. So we'll share this again, and really get your hand on Rebecca's book any way you can, and of course Rob's book On Trails, which has become one of our best sellers over the last, since we've owned the store in the last 3.5, 4 years, and will continue to be prominently featured there, as will Rebecca's. Thank you both. Rebecca, good night. Rob, good afternoon. Thank you everyone again, and we will hopefully we'll see you again soon for another virtual event.
Oh wait, I gotta tell you the end of the joke.
Oh yeah, oh my God.
The punchline to the joke is, why did the marine biology student get an F on his essay about whales? Someone guessed because it blows. No, that was not it. The answer is he didn't have the proper cetaceans. So a little bit of a dad pun to end this wonderful discussion. I apologize to everyone. I probably should have just let things go.
Well, we've set a new precedent here for bad jokes and virtual events. Thank you for that as well. All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.